It's Monday, December 5th, 2022. This is a special meeting of the Weston Board of Education, and it's a special meeting in many ways. It's the semi-annual recognition of students who have excelled in the arts, academically, and in the pool and on the volleyball court. And we'll also have a special recognition of 3 members of the community who volunteered their time and their expertise to serve on the Board of Education. It's only been one meeting. And so with that, I believe we have a quorum. Everyone's here. Could we have a Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The first item on the agenda, is a recognition of former Weston Board of Education members Tony Pesco, Taffy Miller, and Victor Escadin. Melissa, do you want to do the honors?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to speak briefly on behalf of the town and the district and the Board of Education, and thanking Tony, Victor, and Taffy for their fine service to the schools. I bet none of you expected when you signed up to volunteer for the Board of Education to have such a wild ride that we had together. A global pandemic, a change in superintendent, facilities changes on our campus. I mean, we dealt with some really big issues. We spent a lot of time together, and your professionalism, your intelligence, your thoughtfulness, your creativity, your hard work, the town and the schools are certainly a better place for each of you having spent time on the Board of Ed. And personally, I enjoyed the time we had together. I think working with you on these issues and the time we spent was a highlight for me personally, and for some of the other fellow board members as well. And I hope when you look at the district and the schools that you can see the impact that your ideas and your thoughts and your analysis and your questions had on these fantastic schools that we have here in Weston, and these children that are going through the schools. And I hope you're proud of that, as I am for you. And I'm grateful for the friendship we had during these times, and I know it will transcend this experience together. So thank you very, very much. We are a better place for your service. And we have these nice gifts for you. So come on up. Oh, we do.
DeVito's going to take it.
Okay. We'll take it. I'll give you your gift and we can use that. It's for
okay.
It'll be a nice prop.
Nice photo.
Lisa, you want to come up?
Oh, yeah, I'll come up.
Hey, no pressure.
Okay, check us out on Instagram.
Make me look skinny.
Weston PSL. No, just take a good one and post it.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
guys.
Thank you.
And the next item on our agenda is the semi-annual recognition of our students for their academic achievement, for their achievement in the performing arts, and for their athletic achievement. Megan?
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here to recognize our amazing scholars and our talented athletes. So I would like to start with William Bayo, who's being recognized as a College Board National Hispanic Recognition Scholar. He's not here. I think we're going to have a number of students who won't be here tonight, but we're going to recognize them. William Stammer, who's being recognized as a 2022 All-National Honor Ensemble's Mixed Choir member. And I know George is here, George Todorovich, who's being recognized for the Richard William Anderson Award. And this award, to make sure I get this right, was presented by the American Legion, and George was elected to the office of Governor of Boise State, and was the recipient of the prestigious Richard William Anderson Award presented to the boy whose enthusiastic participation and dedication have advanced the principles that make for a good democracy. Congratulations, George. You can come on up. And I know Brooke is here as well. We have Brooke Wagner, who is honored as a National Merit semifinalist this year. A very great honor. So come on up, Brooke. Congratulations. And I'll be standing in for Mark Berkowitz, who couldn't be here tonight, as well as Brandon, our swim coach, Brandon Barone, our swim coach. So we have Kelly O'Carmody. Is Kelly here? I think so. Who is being honored for volleyball as a volleyball all-state athlete. And we are also recognizing Brandon Barone, the coach of the girls swim team, for his 8th straight state championship. Amazing. And yes, Brandon couldn't be here tonight. We're also recognizing the following swimmers as swim and dive all-state athletes, which is a great honor. We have Amelia Bailey, Sophia Shemiel, Olivia Huey, Adele Copus, Callie Mandel, Francesca Sparagna, and Madison Winslow. And you might want to stay close. So we are also recognizing all of the members of the girls swim and dive team for their state championship. Again, as we said, it was their 8th straight state championship. Amazing swimmers. So congratulations to Millie Bailey, Zofia Shemiel, Paige DeFelice, Gabby Gakowski, Olivia Huey, Isabel Huey, Maddie Young, Adele Copus, Emily Krieger, Kelly Leahy, Callie Mandel, Frankie Plum, Maddie Revson, Skylar Shapiro, Francesca Sparagna, Annabelle Tabaki, Katerina Todorovich, Madison Winslow, and Abby Winslow. Congratulations to our girls swim and dive team, state champs. And that does it.
Congratulations, everyone. That's quite an achievement across the board, academically, in the arts and athletics. It's fantastic. And the next item on the agenda is a presentation by SLAM. This is a presentation on projecting the enrollment outlook for Weston schools for the next 10-plus years.
So at this time, we'd like to welcome Mike Zuba, and we invite our students that were recognized as well as of our board members. Feel free to excuse yourselves, or you are welcome to hear the enrollment presentation.
All right. We're good? I'm good. All right. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to start off and go through tonight's presentation. We always start with a comparison of sort of how we've performed over the years, and that's something I'll circle back to towards the end. So based on last year's enrollment projections, which we did about the same period of time, they're always based off of the October enrollment. It's what the state requires for enrollment projections. The overall enrollment performed really well with just spread of just under 24 students, 1% accuracy across the board. I think some of the highlights are the K enrollment. We were within 2 students there, and each of the grade levels except 8 within single digits there. So I think the overall enrollment projection model that we have been using is working really well. I'll go through some of the enrollment drivers locally, then I want to take a step back and talk about some of the trends we're seeing, not only throughout the state of Connecticut, but also in some of your peer districts, just data points that I happen to have from my work throughout the fall. So this is similar to last year with the census data that came out. We have some additional data on that, but about a 2% growth in the overall population for town. Nothing's changed since last year's update. We were able to get cohort level data, so this is where you'll begin to start seeing some new information based on the 2020 census. This chart breaks down all of the age cohorts according to the 2020 fielding of the census by age groups. What we do is we look at the percent change or the total change overall from 2010 to 2020. Part of that data that has come out is just the median age in town. Not surprising to see that increased from 42 years of age back in 2010 to almost 48 years of age in 2020. What I will note now is that none of the changes that happened through all of the demographic shifts and the housing activity since the pandemic happened are captured in this data set yet. That'll be captured in the estimates that are getting put out in May of 2023. We have some notable growth, though, in those 20 to 34-year-olds, as well as the over 55 population that corresponds with the increase in the median age. We also had a decrease in those in the 40 to 44-year-old cohort. We did do an analysis of females of childbearing age where it just basically disaggregated this chart down a little bit further by male and female. Once again, that had a 20% decline. It's very similar to the decline experienced from 2000 to 2010. Even with that decline of females of childbearing age, you can see on our historic births, that has been on the rise over the last few years. We're averaging about 55 students or 55 births from 2015 to 2017. It has been incrementally increasing since then. The 2022 births are estimated at 76. That's based on a January to September reporting period, and we extrapolate the remainder of the year there based on a historic percentage. So the actual there for 3/4 of the year was 56. Just to look at the overall unemployment rate, that has been steadily improving since the high of the pandemic, getting back down to pre-pandemic levels, and Weston typically is lower than that of both the state as well as the county as a whole. Using data from the Warren Group, looking at data specifically from actual sales from January through September, we're then able to extrapolate the remainder of the year. You'll see where we're estimating that 2022 is going to come in at just over 200, above where you've been historically, kind of on par with the pre-Great Recession data, but nowhere near the 280 and the 240, the all-time highs that were experienced in 2020 and 2021. This is a trend that we're seeing across the board in many communities throughout Connecticut and the Northeast, with changes in lending as well as supply and demand. We're seeing those overall total number of home sales dropping off a bit, but you're still well above where you were, say, from 2013 through 2019. There's the overall median sale price pulled over that same period of time, shown on the right. You're still above what your historic high was and topped the historic high of last year as well at 1.075 million. Looking at some of the neighboring communities on the right, everybody has fully recovered from the Great Recession, as you can see in the stacked or in the orange bar charts. Some of those communities have increased more rapidly than others since the pandemic has hit and is waning. Permitting activity averaging about 10 new housing units over the last decade. These are for new construction of dwelling units. They don't count things like permits for decks, additions, anything that you would require pulling a permit for. We've ferreted all that out, and this is really just looking for new units. Over the last 3 years, it's about a dozen, so up a little bit, but nothing really over that historic average. And talking with the town planner, the land is pretty constrained. A lot of the buildability or build out that could be in town is really kind of built out, for lack of a better term. There are a few properties there that are being explored, but nothing that will yield a tremendous number of lots. And with nothing imminent for development, we didn't make any adjustments to the projections based on this. It's just something that we're watching. And since the adoption of the village center regulations, which allow for residential development above commercial, there have been no applications and no development proposed to date yet within the new village center. This is taking a step back and looking at the overall snapshot. I think what we do here, and it's basically tie a lot of data to our geographic information systems, but really want to focus on the overall population growth. I know with the 2020 census coming out, we wanted to be able to paint a bigger picture of what's happening. I circled it in blue. Many of the communities across the state of Connecticut are in that yellow or orangish red, which indicates that they've been on the decline in total population. So even though there's been a modest growth statewide, a large number of those communities in lower Fairfield County circled have been those that have grown overall, and the growth is based on a percentage basis just to even the playing field between some of our smaller suburban communities and our larger urban communities. But where you could see is that Weston and a lot of the neighbors are in that 0 to 5% overall total population growth, with some of the largest growing being Stanford, Danbury, and Bethel. Taking a look at the state birth data, it's been reported and the numbers are finally in. The births have had an uptick for the first time in many, many moons. You'll see that an all-time low in 2020 of 33,500 births has now jumped up to 35,260 births, getting it back to where you were or where the state was about 6 or 7 years ago. I know when we're going out and we're doing projection updates, we started seeing it pretty early on when the data came in for 3/4 of 2021, that births were in fact on an uptick, and it really happened statewide, not just in the communities that we are working on. So when we're seeing trends in Weston of, even though females of childbearing age are going down, we're getting births are going up. That's something that's been more of a larger statewide trend that's been happening across many communities in the state. And this map is following in that same sort of pattern of colors with, the declining categories in yellow, orange, and red, and growth in green, with the darker green being the more intensive growth of just looking at that birth trend from 2012 through 2021. And you could see Weston there in that, right almost in the center of that blue circle, is one of those communities that has had growth in births overall, as well as some of the surrounding communities around it. And I will point out that this goes back to a point in time for 2012. So if a community did have a big birth year there, they may show up as a community that is having a more modest increase, where if you were to compare the last few years, they may have had a much greater. But it's a good data point to take a step back and take a look around at what's happening with your neighbors as well as throughout the state. I know I spend a lot of time as part of our enrollment projections talking about birth decay, and births 5 or 6 years ago yield a certain number of kindergartners. This paints that picture of those communities that have a lot of immigration or a lot of families moving with kids in tow, not yet quite in kindergarten or not yet quite of school age yet. And you'll see where those jump out on the map as those in the darker green color. You could focus in on Weston and Westport there in Fairfield County as being those with the 2 or higher birth decay ratios, so getting much greater level of immigration. Typically we see a lot of our urban communities are much below 1, so they're always typically shown in red, as well as some of those communities that have a pretty even in and out shown in the yellow. But anything in green is showing as a community that has a good amount of immigration without a loss of students in that birth decay, so those families moving in with kids less than 5 years of age. And this is taking a look at the overall trend in public school enrollment going all the way back to 1960. We don't have the full data set for 2022 yet, but I think what this points out is that it's really becomes a series of peaks and troughs. What you could see going through the baby boom and the big push of when we had kind of busting at the seams, or a bulk of our school buildings were built in the state of Connecticut going back to the late 60s, and throughout the 1970s is when we were at our peak enrollment overall. And then really enrollment hit that trough or bottom in 1988, 89, peaked again in 2004, right before the Great Recession. And the second trough as it's coming along in 2020, 21, you can see it's much shallower, as well as the second peak was much shallower. And that's something that demographers have been speaking about happening not only in Connecticut, but nationwide, and following those boom and bust cycles. It's just not as radical or is not as pronounced as it was, say, back in the 70s, and that troughing then in the late 80s. And this is the overall school enrollment trend for the state of Connecticut. You could see where the first year of the pandemic in 2021 really messed up the overall trend line and dropped it down lower than it should have been. But overall, Connecticut had a much more pronounced decline and loss of enrollment, largely driven by those larger urban school districts that really took a hit on their enrollment overall, but really flat enrollment over the last 2 years. So even though some communities saw a bit of an uptick, we're still sort of battling against the tide on those high school classes graduating and being replaced by some larger kindergarten classes. So we aren't quite yet on the upswing of that larger cyclical cycle, that chart that I had shown earlier. And this is taking a look at the overall statewide trends for enrollment over that same period of time. Really now in this one, the yellows become more of a modest decrease. I think it's less than 10%, and there's only one category of green, indicating those that have had increased enrollment since 2012, 2013. So based on the updates that we did the past fall, I wanted to really provide sort of a focused look at some of your neighboring communities, and the first one is Westport, and I really focused on their K-5 enrollment there in that top chart. So what you'll see is hitting bottom in 2019, and then overall adding about 100 elementary school students each of the last 3 years as part of the pandemic push through there, and they're seeing similar trends as other communities with just heightened real estate activity as well as a push of students in. But this is probably one of the handful in the state that has really seen a turnabout in the overall K-5 or the overall elementary enrollment in the school system there, going from that steady decline and almost like flattening off to rebounding right back up as part of it. And then below that, showing the birth trend overall. Mind you, the 2021 births for the state had a bit of an uptick. You'll see in Westport in that chart below the last 3 years of birth data before you start to see the colorful projected lines out, showing a very pronounced uptick in births overall there. So not only have they had a rebound in elementary school with having now 3 large birth cohorts that are about to feed into the system in the next 10 years, you'll see that increase is going to be sustained. The upper right showing Darien, which has been very steady enrollment overall. I've been working in Darien for a number of years. They haven't had the big decline coming out of the Great Recession, but also they haven't had the big uptick as part of the pandemic and now post-pandemic. Very marginal change overall there in their total elementary enrollment. They too have experienced a bit of a birth uptick over the last few years. However, it's a little bit more cyclical there overall. On the upper left is Ridgefield. That's another community that I've been working with for a number of years. They've troughed as part of the Great Recession in that first year, and then had an uptick in 21, 22, and this last year that enrollment flattened off. Their births below show a big birth spike in 21. However, the year before that, as well as 22 estimates, are showing that it's more of a cyclical in nature in that you have the smaller birth cohorts, the big bump, the smaller birth cohorts, and modeling that out, you would expect to follow that typical birth cycle there. Same can be said for Wilton, where the last few years there, you can begin to see that birth cycle of peaks and valleys. But overall, births are up slightly there, but not to the level that we've seen in some other communities. I focused on the way their school system is grouped, that pre-K2 structure, similar to Weston, where we see the enrollment bottoming out in 2020 and that enrollment then picking up over the last 2 years, getting back up over 800 to almost 850 students there, going back to where they were about 6 or 7 years ago. All right, with that, I'll get right into your enrollment update. And your overall PK-12 enrollment has been on a bit of a steady decline over at least the last 10 years from where you had that bit of a flattening period. I keep going back to that chart on the right of just looking at those cohorts of graduating larger, being replaced by smaller. You could see by the chart that has conditional formatting on it here, where the greens indicate those big cohorts and the reds indicate those tiny cohorts. And Oranges and yellows mean somewhere in between. You're still seeing where now we're getting some stability there overall in those K cohort sizes, but really what's happening is we're graduating big, being replaced by small. Eventually, all 13 grades are reflective of that smaller cohort rather than having the mix of much larger and much smaller cohorts that you've had over the last 15 or so years. And this is just a breakdown based on your grade grouping. Overall declined by about 24 students, 1.1% overall. The blue bars on the bottom of the bar chart represent those pre-K2 grades. What we're seeing there is that it really bottomed out around 2019, and enrollment has increased, but very modestly over the last couple years. I think 22, 23 has been buffered. It would have been very similar to 21, 22 if it wasn't for a larger number of students in pre-K there. But then we're looking at the orange showing the intermediate school. Enrollment's been really flat there, as well as the middle school really flat, and the high school has experienced about a 25 student decline over the last year. This takes a look at the net migration, so looking at the different grade groupings, and I grouped elementary and WIS together there on the left. Looking at the total student body and does it shrink, does it grow from year to year? I think what jumps out to me is that the third bar in from the right shows 2020 when we had a lot of immigration in at 44 students. It wasn't something out of the ordinary like we've seen in some other communities where it doubled what that historic immigration was. It was on par with two different points of time in your past. And that has waned over the last 2 years. The middle school enrollment, looking at the net migration there, it's positive, showing in the green. However, the last 2 years has been about a half dozen students. You really peaked in that regard about 5 or 6 years ago. And then the high school net migration overall is really a net out migration is what we historically see. We had a big outmigration in 21, 22. However, that has balanced out a little bit and getting closer to what that recent historic average has been versus that really large group that we saw in 21, 22. Tracking your diversity of your student body across the board based on the 21, 22 data. That I believe became official in May or so from the state, tracking at 23%. Going back as far as I can go back in the data sets that I have, goes back to 2007 to 2008 at about 5%. So definitely the student body is becoming more diverse. The largest groups that have been growing over the last decade have been those that are identified as Hispanic and Latino, as well as 2 or more races, and to a lesser extent Asian students there overall, but where it stands in 21, 22 is at 23% overall. Taking a look at a more detailed historic look back at the enrollment at Hurlbut, you could see that enrollment troughed back in 1920, but we've had a little bit of an uptick. I mentioned earlier that's in part due to that larger number of pre-K students, but not back to what that orange line is indicating as your long-term historic median there. But overall, the K2 cohort averaged 424 students, compared to just under 400 5 years ago. So the last 2 years, just looking at that K2 cohort is definitely increased above where you were 5 years ago. Looking at the intermediate school, that enrollment keeps declining there. I think this year when I took a deeper dive on that, it really can be pinpointed by losing and graduating a larger 5th grade cohort of almost 180 students. Then you look at this year's 5th grade, according to October 1st, of about 150 students. That in part leads to that continued decline that I kind of talk about in the school system of losing big cohorts, matriculating smaller cohorts up and through. Looking at the middle school, just under 540 students. This year, right on par where you were last year. Overall, it's stabilized, but it continues to decline with those smaller cohorts working their way through the system. And then in high school, looking at the enrollment of just under 740. a notable decline over each of the last 3 years, from where you were a bit stable really about 3 to 6 years ago. But all cohorts, all 4 cohorts in high school are of similar size, really ranging from about 180 to about 190 students. So we don't anticipate to have any really pronounced declines based on those cohorts sort of leveling out. Getting into our overall enrollment projections, we rely on the cohort survival to do grade level projections by school. I do talk a lot about ratios, the persistency ratios. The main thing is that if it's 1, it means that there wasn't any change to that cohort size from one year to the next. If it's 1.05, it means that you really grew by 5%. So a cohort of 100 first graders grew by 5 students as they moved into second grade the following year. And all of the factors that we analyze get kind of built into the modeling of these different ratios as we project going forward, and we change our assumptions there at different points in time. So everything we look at, housing, housing starts, housing sales, student enrollment, that all gets factored into these ratios that drive the model, especially for those kids that are already in seats long term. I think one of the big things looking at the ratios, and I won't blind everybody by looking at all these decimal points and digits out there, but going to the far right, you had really a high of your high migration in 2020, 21 was over 4%. It wasn't an all-time high. You've historically had a good amount of immigration going back to 17, 18, 18, 19. You were actually a little bit below that as far as the first year of the pandemic, so you didn't see these dramatic changes that a lot of school systems and communities saw. And then when we looked at 21, 22, and 22, 23, you've kind of dropped back to about where you were. Historically, you could see there's some annual fluctuations there, but really getting back to that pattern that's so similar to Weston overall. I did note that your birth decay continues to be elevated. You had an all-time high in 16, 17 of 2.6. Now it's settled around 2.3, showing that there's still we're still picking up on families that have moved with children, not yet school age, coming into kindergarten there. And then lastly, one of the things I'd like to point out is just that 8 to 9 transition. I remember talking last year about having 2 years of data. It looks like now when you compare back historically, we're now modeling a bit of a loss of students there based on those 0.95s, 94s, 97s there that we saw over the last few years. Looking at that pattern as a little bit of a loss of students from 8th to 9th grade overall. As part of our projections, we're assuming that there'll be 45 pre-K students enrolled annually over the next decade. It's not something we project, it's something we reach out and get input from the administration on of what they're planning for. Our high model assumes that we're going to have births that are going to average 74 annually. We were estimating 71 for this year, so not a tremendous uptick of what your most recent data point is, but an uptick nonetheless. The immigration of 3% average annually over a decade, that aligns with your historic average, but I will note the historic average also has some of the elevated data from the pandemic. The median model assumes 72 births annually, about where you were at for this year. And immigration of 2.8%, so only 0.2 of a percentage point difference over 10 years, slightly below the historic average. And then the low model assumes births at 66 annually, as well as only a 2.2% historic immigration, which is well below your historic immigration over the last decade. So looking at our birth versus kindergarten immigration, I think that red box sums it up well. The green part of the stack bar indicates the percentage of your K student body that migrated in or wasn't born within the town of Weston. The blue represents the percentage that was born here. Overall, pretty steady the last 2 years, but looking back, you could see that the green proportions of those bars are larger than they were, say, 15, 20 years ago. It's just that rising and changing birth decay number. If you were to rely on a historic static birth decay, you would never be able to project the correct number of kindergartners. So that's why we have a little bit of a different methodology that we use. So getting into that, we do blend two different methodologies. It's that first part is the variable birth decay, which we have a best fit line that we use to establish an equation, which then determines based on the variables we have, determines what that kindergarten is going to look like. We regress directly to kindergarten from those variables, and that regression-based formula then ties in things like historic births, home sales, K data. So basically, by running this variable birth decay as well as this regression, we're taking two different methodologies that actually work together in concert, and all those variables and balance each other out, and have been doing a really good job of projecting K for Weston over the last few years. And I think it's I think you're actually the only community that I use that methodology in, just based on the dynamics of it, where you are, the size of it, and knowing that you have such small birth cohorts and you have such large birth decay, that you need to have the ability to balance that out in order to get your best projections going forward. This is just a look at what that regression formula looks like for the K, and this contributes to 50% of our projection. The regression, the other 50% is from that variable birth decay, and then our assumptions outlined below that feed into that K regression overall. So as we develop those low, medium, and high models for our K projections. Overall, our three lines shown in the blue, the green, and the yellowish orange shows that all three models are pretty narrowly banded out in the first 5 years. We have about 125 or so student spread. I'm just catching now that bullet doesn't line up with my chart, but the data on the chart is correct. I just didn't update the bullet. That's something I'll change. So really looking at from 2164 to 2297. So that's your total spread for the entire pre-K-12 system. As we get a little bit further out, it depends a little bit more on our overall assumptions, especially as we get out into that 8th, 9th, and 10th year. That's where that spread, focusing on the medium and high models, which show modest increases, get out to about 2,350 to 2,500 students out 10 years, whereas that low model, which I mentioned, has a much lower estimate of migration built into it, something that you haven't seen, it's lower than your historic average, remains very flat. So that's assuming that if conditions are more, I guess pessimistic would be a word, or conditions aren't favorable, and you had all-time low immigration as well as those lower births, you would have a flat line of about 2,200 pre-K-12 students overall. And from the data that we're seeing, we're looking at the medium model as being the most likely going forward. However, we provided you with all three of them. This is a look at the elementary, the pre-K-2 projections going forward. We're still looking at a little bit of a dip next year, going down to about 460 or so students, and then an incremental increase to the point where you reach about 500 students and then really level off. And part of that is looking at those larger birth cohorts that we know have happened. The reported births began to start feeding into the system, as well as some of those, some of that, I guess, immigration stabilizing off at about 2.8% there. Really not a dramatic change. We're talking about you're at 474 and you're going to go up to about 500, so maybe 25, 35 students spread across 3 grades overall, but it's growth nonetheless. Looking at the intermediate school enrollment, we're projecting some larger growth there, especially as we get a larger cohort moving into the 3rd grade next year. We'll see an uptick there, eventually reaching 500 students, plateauing, and then climbing upwards to about 560 students over the last 3 years. So really kind of getting back to where you were about a decade ago for enrollment at the intermediate school. Looking at the middle school, projecting to reach the bottom in 25, 26 at just under 490 students, and then having a bit of a enrollment uptick, getting back to about 540, and then a more pronounced uptick in the last half of that. And with the intermediate school as well as, especially with the middle school, those are students that are in seats already, so we're just really advancing them forward based on those historic persistency ratios that I had mentioned earlier. And then last but not least, taking a look at the high school enrollment overall, looking at that to continue to decline, getting to about 650 to 660, really for a chunk of our projection horizon, and then a very modest rebound at the end to getting back to almost 700 students there, but really seeing that as sort of the bottom of the high school enrollment within the latter half of this projection window. And this is just looking at the individual grade cohorts as we're projecting them over the next 10 years, as well as the change by grade grouping on the right. I won't spend a lot of time going through that. And the takeaways, I think I hit on most of these as part of my discussion, so that's just kind of like a leave behind, but I will touch on just looking at the historic modeling. I went all the way back to the 2017 projections that we did and began running different spaghetti lines out for both the entire K-12, taking out pre-K out of the equation, and then K-2 on the right-hand side with the bars showing the standard deviation, just to see where the projections stand. And I will point out that the bars on the bar chart are very tight together. So as you see the different lines sort of ending, that was the end of that individual 10-year projection horizon. So you look at the mustard color lines, and I use the same color, represent that 2017 fall enrollment projection. They sort of end on 2027. They're lower, so they didn't pick on any of that up. They didn't pick up on, or they were silent to any of that uptick with the pandemic, as well as the birth increases that we've seen over the last few years, but nonetheless all falling within that same general range. The black lines represent the actual enrollments overall, and then the blue, or the very brightly colored blue, as well as the orange, represent those 21 and 20 lines. So they're on the higher end of when we first started seeing the increased housing sales, the pandemic overall. But there's still, when I tracked that line out and compared it to the purple line, which is our 2022 model, I believe it's about a delta of 30, 35 students on that 10th year. So even though it looks like it's exaggerated, they're all tracking pretty well. And then on the chart on the right, following that same methodology, but now looking at a y-axis that is only spanning 25 per break point. You could see where all the models are pretty tightly clustered. It looks a little bit further spread out just because of the scale of it. But looking at the elementary enrollment, you could see where that purple and blue line were, or that blue line was on the higher side of where we were. That purple line has now taken up a lot of that blue line, which is picking up on those elevated births that we've seen over the last few years. So as we added 10 births annually and now 14 births annually, it's picking up on that and projecting those forward. But when you look at the difference between, say, our high line and then the line from, say, 2017, which is, it ends at 425 students in 27, 28. The most recent line is at 475. So really only derivation of about 25 students per grade. So 25 students spread across those three different grades, are actually a little bit less than that. It's a spread of about 50 spread across three grades there. So we're not seeing a lot of major changes based on how we've modeled over the years, which I thought was kind of interesting. When I take a look back at some other communities that we've done a lot of work and have gone through the demographic shifts of the pandemic, we see much greater changes in the enrollment drivers there than we have in, say, a community like Weston. I remember last year's discussion and presentation where we talked about, even though we have elevated conditions, we're not seeing dramatic impacts on the enrollment. It's something that we're still not seeing going forward. We're really just coming out of that typical cycle of enrollments where you peak, you trough, you peak and trough. So really just looking at the enrollment sort of getting to equilibrium overall for the entire school system. With that, I'll pass it over to the board. I'm sure there's questions. I'd rather focus our time on things that you want to ask rather than me talking about a spaghetti chart that's probably blinding everybody, but thank you for your patience.
Are there questions from anybody?
I've got some questions. Looking at your methodology, just out of curiosity, how is it you determine the childbirth numbers? Where are we finding that information?
I ran, based on the females of childbearing age and fertility rates, I projected births going out forward, and then I threw those away because I realized that it was telling me that you would only have like 20 births. So I went back to, I was all excited to get the data from the census. I'm like, oh, wow, we have like 5-year cohorts. I'll apply the ratios and see. And you weren't the only one. A bunch of communities, the data from the census didn't match up what we're seeing on the ground birth-wise. So I went back to what we do is we run basically a regression. We look at different variables. We look at the past births, we look at enrollment, and we look at housing activity, and we're able to regress births going forward. It's something that we've been doing here for a number of years. The models have been working pretty well, so we went back to that. We're hopeful that when the census gives us good numbers in May, maybe we can go back to doing demographic models. We used to do demographic models all the time. It's just, I don't think the demographics they're capturing are very good right now at the federal level.
Well, that probably has more to do, or my question, I guess I should say without phrasing it as an opinion, is do you think that that's reflective of COVID then? Is that what's caused the big misunderstanding?
I think it was the time it was fielded. So like when you look at the census was fielded in 2020, right at the start of the pandemic, like you could have a perfect storm of getting bad demographics. And then you had an unusual event, caused a lot of movement. We didn't pick up on any of that movement. I think that's what kind of led to some bad data compared to what we had in the past. And it's just unfortunate. Not a fault of how they're doing it. They've done it that way forever. But I think what that's where having done this enough, you could begin to go back and say, the data is no good or it's not modeling, what we're seeing. And for a place like Weston where you're not going to have a dramatic range of births, you can go back to mathematical models and come within that same range. So it worked pretty well. Versus like cities that have larger populations, there the demographic models are working a little bit better just because you have a, lack of a better term, you have a larger sample size. You have a larger N there of females of childbearing age. Yep.
One more question.
Yep.
Actually, I've got a couple more, but before I dominate all the time. The other thing was you had a slide in here in which you're talking about immigration for families with children that were preschool age and kindergarten, and also, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed to reflect families that had children even prior to attending preschool numbers, or is that not correct? And if so, I'm just curious as to how you calculated those numbers as well.
Yeah, I can, let me, I know which one you're talking about. Let me just pop back to it so I have this chart.
Not that one. I think it was prior to getting to Weston specific. It was talking about, was it page 6? Apparently, yeah. Page 6.
Oh, all right, way back.
So way back, yeah.
Yeah, we got it. Yep, all right, so we don't project preschool numbers, but preschool is something that we've been kind of dabbling with, of asking some of our school district clients to call around to the providers and try to get information on Western residents, almost like a census. It's hard for us to be able to do that, but this year I actually piloted using pre-K for K in Westport. So they've been collecting numbers for me for a number of years on enrollment, not only in their schools, but also in all of the private providers. So we have like 7 years of data that we're now kind of running models in the background to see how it's working. But this is just census data of enumerating those that are under the age of 5. So according to the census on how the respondents at the addresses report it, we're showing that there's less 0 to 5-year-olds than there were 10 years ago, is all that's showing.
But that again is coming from the 2020 census?
Yeah, from the
Okay.
2020 census.
And the 2020 census, when was that actually done? I'm trying to,
It was fielded in the spring of 2020.
so just as the
Winter,
pandemic was
spring of
starting to hit.
2020,
Okay.
yeah, like January, February.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
I have a couple of questions, and I'm going to piggyback on Sharon's page 6. So I looked at the report prior to meeting tonight. It was really helpful to have you tell us more. So some of my questions might just be not knowing enough about the data.
Okay, no, shoot away.
Hopefully it benefits somebody else as well by asking these questions. All right, so when I look at this chart in particular, it tells me that the vast majority of the population change is of a non-childbearing age. And then when you look at the age of people coming into Weston, if they do have children, they're probably not in the pre-K 2. They might be in West, or they might be in the middle school. So when you look at a chart like this, and then you talk about these ages matriculating, or the cohorts going through the district, where's the growth coming from?
These are numbers from the pre-COVID,
These are pre-COVID census numbers, so
so the numbers are coming from COVID growth.
the growth in the so there's a disconnect between what we're seeing here and what I'm seeing here. So we're seeing when I look at this data, we're seeing a decline in females of childbearing age. And this is including males and females, so I didn't disaggregate it because it was such a small population. But you've had declines in females of childbearing age the last 20 years, about 20% every 10 years. But what we're seeing on the ground, especially going back to 2019, like pre-pandemic, is that your birth numbers, in spite of having declining childbearing age, is increasing. So that's where we began to see a bit of a disconnect between the census and locally. But I think the last 2 years, where we're seeing the births kind of push up around 70, is likely from a demographic shift that's not picked up on in any of the data. Presumably, when we have a large number of sales in a community that's almost all single-family residential that we had over the last few years, the assumption typically is that not everyone is an empty nester or someone looking to move on or downsize. But a general assumption can be made that a good majority of those sales are to younger families with children. Just kind of broad brushing it. So then that typically sees that you're now having a further disconnect between your real population on the ground and, say, the census thinks we have here. I'm not going to say it's going to completely shift that chart if you were to have new numbers today based on who's actually in the houses now, to everything being green, especially in those 30 to 44-year-old categories. But it would definitely take that and shrink that a little bit, and probably shrink the growth in those older individuals a little bit.
Okay. And prior to tonight, I was looking at some data published by the CDC, and it was about birth rates. How do you, so CDC birth rates, I would imagine, are just that. It's just data. Women giving, having a child. Census is, well, where do they actually wind up? So how do you kind of square up? The CDC is saying that there was this big bust with COVID, which was not anticipated. I read an article that kind of said they thought everyone being locked up at home would create more babies, what they actually found out, maybe jokingly, was locked up at home, nobody wanted to be together. So they report this big bust in 2020 and 2021. And then I read an article, again, by the CDC that said it's not as bad as it looks. Sorry, 22 wasn't as bad as 21, but it's still declining. And they are saying, I think I read an article that said they're expecting the birth rates to continue to decline. So if birth rates are declining, how do you kind of match up census, where people wind up, and the CDC's data on birth rates, and then say we can expect growth in our schools?
Well, Connecticut actually came in second in 2021 on a percent basis for uptick in births nationwide. So Connecticut was one of the largest growing states for the first time in 20 years for births. I don't use CDC fertility rates. I use the National Institute for Health provides us annual updates there on fertility rates. But compared to, say, 1960s, even the late 70s, 80s, yeah, birth rates are down. But a lot of the data shows that they're not going to be down because the big part of the birth decline over the last 15 years was the Gen Xers being the smallest generation, and you have less females of childbearing age in a very small generation. You have the baby boomers, which were huge. Now the millennials are going to be bigger than the baby boomers. So with greater number of females of childbearing age as part of the millennials, as they come into sort of settling down, having families, birth rates, everything that I've read, are going to be on the rise. And, you know, the whole local component of that is different for everybody based on, you know, the housing, the economics, position in the economy. But I think there'll be a lot of revisions to a lot of publications in the next 5 years talking about birth rates.
Okay, and my last question, which might be out of your scope of the demographics, but do you have any feedback that, you know, you brought up Ridgefield, Westport, Darien, where they're actually seeing an uptick in enrollment? Is there anything that, you know, when you look at us, either as a town or as whatever, that stands out that you can say, you know, this might be a reason why you're seeing a decline, or this is what this other town offers that's attracting people from elsewhere? Like, do you have anything like anecdotal that would square
Yeah.
up that?
I think one of the biggest differences, so in the communities that are growing and have been growing over the last few years, and some of them even were before COVID, they were growing, they have housing at different price points. So they have diversity in housing, where young families can move in a true starter and then trade up if, you know, people are moving to, you know, to well-regarded school districts, and they're moving to those that have different options for housing. Whereas in Weston, your housing is all very similar. You don't have a lot of really diverse housing for new families, young buyers, and those looking to buy within the market. You're kind of limited on what you offer, say, compared to, you know, many of the other surrounding communities, except for some of them even more sort of rural, exurb communities. You know, you have large lot zoning, you have larger single-family homes. You know, that doesn't appeal to a wider range of buyers than, say, a community that you can get a very small, more modest home, you can get a larger home, you can get rental, you have everything in between for a range of lifestyles.
Thank you.
So, Mark, if I look at these, I guess the class years that we should really focus on is 5th grade and 9th grade. It really seemed, especially 5th grade, the numbers as they flow through, to future years, really kind of are pretty volatile. Am I looking at that correctly?
Did I get the right chart for you?
No, I'm just on chart 43, 10-year projection,
Yep.
medium case. Because we're, you know, we're studying what we think the optimal configuration of our schools are, with,
Yep.
you know, with currently with the 4 schools. And, I mean, they're just numbers, but I mean, as an example, 4th grade in 23-24 goes from 166 and then down to you know, then the 5th grade is 11 students, you know, more than that, smaller, and then it seems to fluctuate in the middle school years and then into the high school years.
Yeah, so the way I like to read these charts is you read them from the top left to the lower right. So I'll just start with this year's kindergarten class of 128.
Yeah.
You always grow a lot between K and 1. So what we see is that class grows to 143, 155, 163, and don't mind my unsteady finger on this, 170, 174, getting to the 180s, 183, and in the 10th year they don't graduate, but in the 12th year you would see that once you get to high school, you have a little bit of erosion from 8 to 9, but then you're pretty steady once you get into high school. So we always start on the upper left and track across. I think what this tells us is that we have a very small 5th grade this year that's now going to move up into the middle school next year. So when I look at next year or this year's 6th grade at 180, that 180 becomes 158 next year in 6th grade, and then you still have those two larger cohorts. If I were on your committee to be space planning for all of your schools, I would really focus on the grouped enrollment and compare that to your capacities. I would look at this middle projection as well as this high and low projection and compare the space that you would need, say, at year, and I always like to keep it around 5 years having very, very good accuracy in any projection. So really looking at that 27 year and say, for our pre-K2s, the high model saying we'll have 536. The low model is saying in that same year we'll have 504. So our delta is 32 students spread across really 3 grades with pre-K assuming it's static. So less than 10 students per grade between your high and low model. And you could do that for all of the buildings themselves. They're all grouped right here with WIS and the middle school, and use both that high and low as your boundaries for your space planning to see whether or not you could achieve what you're testing based on those two scenarios, and that'll give you very good certainty on whether or not you can be able to implement the changes that you're planning on if it works under both of those.
And how much does home sales factor into, your projections?
How much does
Home sales, turnover of homes. I mean, I'll make it easier. So if we went back to an environment where our home sales trended at somewhere between 100 and 125 a year, would that change your numbers in terms of anticipated births? And
I think if you were to get to 100 home sales or 125, I don't think I've ever seen that in Weston that low.
no, it troughed in '09 at 95, but we've also never seen interest rates like this in 20 years. So
Yeah, that would have been recession home sales. I would probably say the low model would be a very good proxy for where you're at.
Yeah.
But even then, if I were to look at the persistency, so your immigration in '08 and '09, and I'm sorry if I'm making somebody dizzy here, I apologize, I'm just flipping really quick. So going back to '08 and '09 on this chart, you were still at 2.5. Well, when the Great Recession hit, you were at minus 1.18, but then, 08, 09, 9, 10, you were at 2.5%. So that's right in line with that low model that we produced. So I would say if you wanted to speculate what 10 years of post-Great Recession would look like in a row, that's what that low model would look like.
yeah, but we're in a totally different interest rate environment. That's the difference between
We're also
what
in a different,
happened post-recession and where we are today.
but we're also in a completely different birth environment too.
Yeah.
I think the takeaway is this, like, I track back, going back to 2017, and all the bands are honestly within 50 students.
Yeah.
And I'm giving you 3 different bands with a high and low going forward. Like, if for some reason we get into this massive recession, there's still kids, there's still families, there's still education that needs to happen. Enrollment doesn't go to zero.
Yeah.
And you're going to be on that low margin. If things stay elevated, you're going to be on that high line. I know your buildings just from, having been in them, having been part of different processes. I think you're talking about a range in the models that are so tight that you could test against both of those, and probably you have a good understanding if you could achieve what your desired result is, and with confidence, based on those different models that we've given you. There isn't anything that's going to return the enrollment to anything lower than that low projection is yielding. You probably have a greater chance of trending towards that high projection, which in all honesty represents your 10-year historic average for immigration, which includes a little bit of the pandemic and a little bit of the push pre-pandemic and a lot of the Great Recession recovery. I hope that makes sense.
No, it does. No, thanks.
Mike,
Anyone? Go ahead, David.
I have one more question that sort of segues on the question about the housing sales that Steve's asking. So do you have any data for housing sales over the past 2 years? If the houses that sold, were they sold to families that had kids that they then enrolled into Weston? And I think that's the big caveat. So did they have kids, and did those kids enroll into Weston?
No,
That's not conveyed in any of the information. And
No, that's that's what we don't know, and we're going to find out. I mean, forever we've really not been aware of who moved in and who moved out, and that's why, to me at least, when we were doing the FOC, with the housing turnover we had, you would think that the people that chose to leave didn't have kids in the school system, and people who moved in would. Now, some of the numbers would indicate that's the case, but nowhere near there's what you would have thought given the number of houses that turned over, over a relatively short period of time.
Right. Like anecdotally, on my own road, 3 houses turned over during the pandemic, and not one turned over to a family with kids.
Yeah.
Not one. They all turned over to older families who were, the appeal was the larger house on more land.
Yeah.
So it's,
there's exactly, and I don't know any way to get the answers to the questions that you're asking of, like, who left and who bought, because I know through the real estate transaction process, that's not things that can be asked question-wise, because there's privacy involved with that. But I think when you look at it, and you look at the net migration, and I look at these charts, and I do this all the time, not a tremendous amount has changed here, pandemic, post-pandemic, pre-pandemic, is my professional opinion. Like, you're not one of those communities that are on a different course. You're not on a different trajectory than you've been since I started working here. Like, in 2017, I'm still projecting the same way that I projected pre-pandemic. I'm not assuming that any change, even though you have more housing sales, the historic proportion of who moves in with families is still the same as it ever was. It may be increased a little bit, but it's not changing the trajectory of your enrollment to a great degree that it has in other communities. And I go back to that 2017 projection. I mean, that's still tracking within, on the K-12 level, 50 students of where we projected this year. And so much has changed in the world. Like, if you really think about where we were then and where we are now, and in Weston, it hasn't changed the overall trajectory of your projections tremendously. I think as it comes down to facilities, you have to kind of look at the data, you have to test the high and low, but you can't get lost in the data and making decisions. I think I've been through many school construction, school reorganization, school consolidations, and I advise every committee and board on that of don't try to look for perfect data to make decisions, because the time to make those decisions will pass you by.
I'll ask a few questions.
Go ahead.
So, let's see, is that okay? You had mentioned, what was the number of birds that you eventually did, because you said the model came to 20 or something like that? You thought
No, it was very, very low. It was much lower than what, so we back test the model and
Sure.
over the expected, and it was much lower based on the demographics. I could tell that the females of childbearing age was very underreported.
I see. And then what number did you eventually use as the sort of fuel for this?
I can go to slide. It wasn't dramatic. So our first projected year of births is 23. We have that at 70, so lower than the last 2 years. On par with 20, then it's 71, 72, 73, 74.
All right.
So
So am I reading, I may not be, so help me out. Am I
It's-
reading the math correctly that it looks as though like, basically kids who are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 at this point, that there is a uptick of that age cohort or not?
these are first, second, third, fourth grade up top, fifth grade. I don't have if you were to look, so kids that are 1 were presumably born, actually here. So depending on when they were born, they're part of the 71. So the 71 is larger than your 56 of 5 years ago. So this 56 birth cohort in 2017 yielded 128K in 2022. 54 of 2018 we're projecting is going to yield 126K next year. So that's some of the variability in our model, in that we don't use that static birth decay in how we model it out. It takes into account things like housing, things like turnover, to get to that number, because one would assume that it would be, kind of directly related. I guess that one is only 2. But then when we go up to 64 births, we're yielding 135K. 69 gives us 140. I mean, your range of K in a projection is very narrow, and your historic range of K has been very narrow as well. The band, I mean, we're talking 126 to the peak is 144. So 18 students in your K class size is your high and low over 10 years.
And how many residents overall maybe you have this number, maybe you don't, did we add overall during the years the post-census numbers is essentially what I'm asking.
Yeah, I don't know what that is.
Yeah. Part of what I'm trying to piece it together is what's confusing is it almost feels as though you could disregard the first half of the packet where the numbers are pre-census, just because of the sort of seismic changes that happened, as of March of 2020. Is that accurate or not?
Not really.
No?
It changed some things, but I mean, it didn't change 10 years of data.
Yeah. Well, I think what I'm circling over, which is the same thing. So, anecdotally, of course, it depends on what your anecdotes are. I moved in during this cohort. Every single house that I see is like that people with kids. So then the question I get sort of driven to is like David's question about or not David's, but Steve's question about so are they matriculating at WPS or not? So that's sort of the $1 million question. I don't think you can necessarily answer that, I suppose, but just that's the question I'm puzzling on.
Yeah, great question, and I take it back to, I do demographic work in my own town, and I hear from certain parent groups, and they, this was pre-pandemic, it's like, well, I see mothers everywhere pushing strollers, and it's like, well, you're a mother pushing a stroller.
Precisely.
Precise. And so it kind of becomes of, what you see around you, and it's drawing, parallels to is that what's happening everywhere, right? But I think when it comes down to it, it's like we look at your cohorts coming in, we look at the movement of students that are in your system, and when we look at things like elementary enrollment, especially in a K-2 school, which only has 3 grades in it. I mean, you look at the changes in our assumptions, which between our low model and our high model, in a place like Weston, it's not that dynamic. It's not. So our high model is showing that we can be as many as 540 pre-K2 students, right? Our low model shows that that can be as low as, and I'm just spot looking here, 460 in a completely different year. You should really match up the same years, but the range of the model is not that, there's not that much uncertainty in the model, and there's never been. Going back, to 2017 when I first started modeling data here, it's all been pretty tightly banded.
Okay.
And I think you could try to count every family that moved in and moved out. But at the end of the day, what are you using that to project going forward other than you think you have a point in time of what happened? It's not saying that that's going to be the condition for 5 years and even 10 years. You got to rely on the modeling long term versus seeing through some of the short term changes. I think here is very different than Westport. Westport has seen dramatic changes. There's a lot of new students. Births are up. Housing sales are still up to a greater extent than they are here. Like, that's a different animal.
2.5 times.
And there's other communities outside of Fairfield County that are experiencing very similar trends. Those are completely different animals than we have here, especially as it comes to sort of the facility planning process. I mean, you don't have small neighborhood-based schools. You have these large schools that group by grade that have ability to absorb and ability to shed. So the planning should be not easier, but a little bit more linear of a process.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Mike. I just have a question for you.
Yep.
You've been doing this presentation for us for, many years, and I know you've done it in other Fairfield County towns. So just, when I look at kind of the whole picture, based on the trajectories and the inputs that you've seen in Fairfield County, which towns are we tracking more similarly to, and has that changed in the last 5 years, would you say? And I'm asking your opinion.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to think. It's a hard question.
Yeah.
But I think just from who I've been working with recently, and I can't speak to those that I haven't worked with that may be similar, but I know some of the things I see in Wilton, I see some similarities here, even though you have a little bit different dynamics, just from what has happened enrollment-wise. I know when I did work in Easton Reading back in 21, I think it was, in 20 and 21, back then there was some similarities with your data as well. I think it's just one of those, I mean, everybody's a little bit unique, right? We're 169 towns in the state of Connecticut, but I think, when you really take a look at it, the enrollment drivers aren't all that different. It's just which lever gets pulled harder than others in other communities in Connecticut. It's not like I'm where I do work down in the southeast and they open up a big plant and it's, bringing in 12,000 jobs in 3 years where they're going to build, all this track housing and something completely changes. We're the land of steady habits here in New England, and pretty built out communities with large lot zoning and not a lot of developable land. So I don't see a lot of tremendous variability in what we project going forward for our Connecticut communities compared to the rest of the sort of the East Coast that I work in.
Okay, thanks.
That's kind of taking a really big step back. And
Yeah, no, I understand.
Are there more questions from anyone? Great, thanks. I'm sure there are going to be a lot more questions as we go forward, but
all right, well, good luck. It was good seeing everybody. Enjoy the rest of your night.
that's the end of the agenda. Can I have a motion to adjourn?
I
So
move
moved.
so
Oh, go
moved.
ahead.
Is there a second? Second. All those in favor? Aye?
Aye.
Great. Everybody have a great holiday.
Thanks, you too.
Thank you.